So this is week 3, and this week we will talk about early Korea and early Japan. So immigration flow to the Korean Peninsula came from basically from two directions. The majority of the Koreans, well, especially northern Koreans, came from Inner Asia, Mongolia, Siberia, through Manchuria. But there were also a lot of people who moved between the islands of Japan through the Tsushima Strait and to and from Korea, southern part of the Korean Peninsula. So those were like the two main um, flows of immigration. And the Korean language, just like the Japanese language, belongs to the group of Altaic languages spoken in Manchuria and Siberia. And according to the Book of Documents, one of the ancient texts from China, if you recall, a person, a nobleman, and a sage whose name is Gija, who advised the King Wen of Zhou dynasty, is said to have has been awarded Joseon, which is a name of early Korea, which covers southern Manchuria to northern Korea. But archaeological evidence provides no support for an early involvement with the Chinese heartland, so people say that this is probably a mythical story. But according to Shima Chen's historical records, there was a Lieutenant Waimon from the Han state of Yang who rebelled and fled to Joseon with 1,000 followers and became king around 195 BCE. And a lot of scholars believe that this to be true. Emperor Wu of Han Dynasty, in his attempt to outflank the Xiongnu, so Xiongnu were the nomadic tribe, the non-Chinese nomadic tribe up north who often invaded China, right? They also invaded Joseon and incorporated its northern territory from the Liao River in southwestern Manchuria to present-day Seoul. So this territory was divided among 4 commanderies by the Chinese and by officials assigned from the Chinese capital. So Leyland Commandery, with its seat in modern Pyongyang, was the most important of the 4 and remained under Chinese control until 313 CE. And this increased trade and cultural contact between societies on the Korean Peninsula and Han China, which has archaeological evidence with Chinese burial mounds, Han coins, government seals, and also lacquerware that has Confucian figures painted around the sides. But in this northern region of Korea, conflicts happened frequently, and Han commanderies would suppress raids by using Goguryeo warriors and asking Buyeo, which is a region sort of northeast of North Korea, kind of like in the southern Russian territory of today, to help fight their common enemy. So in 244, during the Three Kingdoms period in China, the Chinese state of Wei captured the Goryeo capital, but did not hold it for long. In 286, after Wei was replaced by the Jin dynasty, the Murong branch of the Shanbei people attacked Buyeo and took thousands of captives. Early in the 4th century, when North China fell in the hands of Xianbei and other non-Chinese rulers, Goguryeo seized Lilang and Daifang. And despite 400 years of Chinese presence in those northern commanderies, the area, including Buyeo, quickly declined, and Goguryeo sort of became the dominant power of North Korea. During this time in southern Korea, this was never under Chinese rule, and there were much smaller polities that were organized into 3 confederations, and those 3 are sort of called the Samhan together. And the Samhan is divided into Mahan in the southwest, Jinhan in the southeast, and Wyeonhan between the 2 in the southern coast. Samhan had about 70 plus polities and nearly 1 million people. It was a stratified society with aristocratic elites that selected their chiefs and lorded over the commoners and low households and slaves. They were an agricultural society that grew rice, and they also supplemented their food by hunting, gathering, and fishing. The Wa, or the old name for the Japanese, also lived along the southern coast, and like I said, these groups frequently crossed between Korea and Japan. And then after the Samhan period, there was this Three Kingdoms period when each of these areas became more sort of clearly defined as a state. And this was during the 4th century. And then, so three distinct territorial states emerged. And this was the Goguryeo in the north, Bakje in the southwest, and Shilla in the southeast. And there was Gaya in the middle. But we'll talk a little bit more about Gaya later. The decline of Chinese power and a diaspora of Chinese fleeting turmoil contributed to the state-building process in Korea, which involved borrowing Chinese political practices as ways to strengthen the king's control, who were military leaders that frequently led armies into battle. The Three Kingdoms period was the era of large mounded tombs found throughout the area and into western Japan, providing strong archaeological evidence that elites controlled extensive resources and labor power. So Goguryeo slowly gained strength for centuries with its center in southern Manchuria. Its rulers are claimed to have been the branch of the Buyeo ruling house. By late 4th century, Goguryeo king Gwanggaeto made advances against the Khitan tribes in Manchuria and other tribes in the present-day Russian maritime province to the east, and by 410 controlled large territories in both places. In 399, King Gwanggaeto sent an expeditionary force to help Shilla drive out invading Bakje and Wad forces, which led to controlling the king of Shilla as his vassal. And the Goguryeo tombs are what we have as archaeological evidence of this time that shows, the large-scale sort of power and resources that the rulers of the Goguryeo period held. But they are reminiscent of Han China's tomb murals in their depictions of earthly life of the tomb occupant, with depictions of dancers, entertainers, also slaves and servants, as well as how these kings went into battle with their chariots and military banners waving in the breeze, also warriors, and images of heaven as well, which had images of phoenix, intertwined snakes, and turtles that were symbolic of the 4 points of the compass associated with the 5 phases theory of Chinese cosmology. So we can see that a lot of these sort of the ruling ideology was substantiated by these sort of Chinese sort of philosophies and cosmology. Okay, so we'll take a look at the Goguryeo tombs.
Visions of a Horseback People, the complex of Goguryeo tombs. The ancient Korean dynasty of Goguryeo was founded in the 1st century BC and lasted for nearly 700 years. Many mural tombs registered as World Heritage Sites lie around Pyongyang. This Anak tomb number 3 has a remarkable diversity of murals. The person depicted on the west wall is the master of the tomb. He is said to be a king who reigned during the mid-4th century. The room is covered in wall paintings. The image behind the red post is of a kitchen. Looking at the mural conveys an idea of how these people lived their lives. The master is heading a large parade. 250 people are following him. Goguryeo people believed in the soul's immortality and wished their same life to continue after death. This is said to explain why so many details of daily life are painted inside their tombs. This is a castle left by the Goguryeo. They constantly fought off Chinese attack and reigned over Northeast Asia. Tomb murals provide us with important clues about the lives of the mysterious Koguryo people. This grave was made for General Chun, a powerful commander. Here there is a scene of cavalry departing to the front. Superior military force expanded their empire. The Koguryo were able to create a unique culture of their own. Here, mounted chargers are firing at targets while galloping on horseback. This could be the origin of yabusame, a Japanese traditional ceremonial art. This woman is wearing a red and blue garment which closely resembles a mural of a garment depicted in a Takamatsu tomb in Japan. It reflects a strong tie between Japan and Koguryo in those days. Koguryo fell after an attack by the allied forces of Tang and Shilla in the 7th century. Through these images, however, we can still learn about the culture and imagine the lives of these people today.
So this film is interesting because it makes links to the Japanese sort of royal tombs, which we will look at a little bit later. But it's also interesting that there was significant amount of traffic between Japan, Korea, and China because later when we will talk about Buyeo, which is the northeastern part of Korea or the southeastern part of Russia today, this area, we'll see later that sort of some of the archaeological evidences are contested, whether it's Korean archaeological evidence or Chinese, because of course Buyeo was had really close connections to China. So in any case, it's interesting to see how the sort of geopolitical boundaries that we hold dear today were not necessarily true, thousands of years back. Okay, so like the Goryeo rulers, Bakje's rulers claimed descent from the Buyeo prince as well. So Bakje, of course, is right here. And in 369, Bakje attacked and defeated its Mahan overlord and soon absorbed much of the rest of Mahan territory, giving it control over the southwestern part of the peninsula. And the Bakje people had much stronger ties to the Japanese than the Goryeo did. Bakje kings established the post of chief minister and set up a system of 16 official ranks. They also promoted Confucian ideas and ordered the compilation of historical records. Bakje was a maritime power conducting trade with both China and Japan, and Bakje transmitted Chinese culture and Buddhism to Japan and sought weapons and military support from Japan. So you can see that they're really critical location that ties them to China and also Japan, sort of gave them the advantage of sort of securing political and economic networks with both countries. And in 493, Bakje forced an alliance with Shilla against Goguryeo, which protected both states for over half a century through a balance of power. And in the 6th century, Bakje worked to strengthen central control by increasing the number of local magistrates assigned from the capital and registering commoners for labor service and tax collection. But Bakje's expansion eastwards was stymied when Shilla took over Gaya Confederation in 562 and was defeated by Shilla in 660 to 663, at which point numerous refugees fled to Japan. So Gaya, if you recall, is a small state right here. So Shilla took over Gaya, and Bakje's sort of expansion, sort of the ambition to expand eastward was severed right there. Okay, so let's look at this history of the Bakje kingdom.
In 18 BC, Baekje was founded in the Hangang River Basin, emerged as the dominant kingdom of the Three Kingdom period, 5th century. In the 4th century, when King Gung Chogo was on the throne, Baekje, with its excellent diplomatic skills and geopolitical location, connected ancient China's Yoso, present-day Hebei, and Shandong provinces to the Korean peninsula and Japan. It became the center of Northeast Asia's economy and trade, due to its important role as marine traffic route. Furthermore, Baekje dispatched many scholars, including Jikki and Wang Yin. These scholars introduced Buddhism, the 1,000-character text, and Chinese literature to Japan. Their teachings helped Asuka culture, Japan's first Buddhist culture in the 7th century, to flourish. Horyuji Temple, located in Nara Prefecture, Japan, is where we can find Baekje's relics. The Baekje Kwanumsang, Avalokitesvara image, enshrined in this building, is the oldest wood-carved structure in Japan. The figure that stands higher than 2 meters, and its graceful beauty, shows the perfection of Baekje's Buddhist fine arts. Baekje is the ancient Korean kingdom that is closely related to Japan. The Japanese still use the word Baekje as the name of an area, and today's Emperor of Japan, Akihito, is a descendant of King Muryeong of Baekje. In 1993, a piece of Baekje's artifact astonished the world. It was the Gundong Daehyangno, the gilt bronze incense burner of Baekje. On the top, a phoenix, which appears as if it is ready to fly away, is holding a Sintonami ball, and on the cover, over 42 animals such as the phoenix, tiger, deer, and others are hanging about in the spaces among 74 mountain peaks. There are nearly 140 sculptures of dancers and musicians who are playing piri, the Korean flutes, and gaeguns, a 12-string plucked zither. Moreover, plants, rocks, mountain paths, streams, and waterfalls around Gundong Daehyangno compel admiration. The body, which is shaped like a semicircular bowl, is composed of 3 layers of lotus flowers and 27 animals. There are 2 people carved in relief. Underpinning looks like a dragon supporting a lotus flower bud in full bloom. Gundong Daehyangno shows the essence of Baekje craft, made of implication of spiritual world and artistic aptitude, and is considered as the best ancient metal craft because of outstanding originality and shape. The collapse of the Baekje dynasty is one of the saddest incidents in history. The Baekje fell due to an attack from the Shilla-Tang alliance. Almost 3,000 court ladies hurled themselves into the Baekmagang River. This cliff is called Nakwa, falling flowers, rock, because the court ladies plunged into their end resembles falling flower petals. The people of the Baekje dynasty are said to have been mild in manner. Their artistic world lives with splendor and mysteriousness, which are unrivaled by any other era.
So now we'll talk about Sheila. Sheila, as we saw on the map earlier, it was the smallest and also the weakest of the 3 kingdoms, but eventually Sheila emerged victorious. The first chiefs of Sheila came from the Bak family, and after that line died out from the Sok and Kim families, who were assisted by a shaman or a spiritual chief. So But like the rulers of Bakje and Goguryeo, Shila's kings institutionalized their government by establishing a ministry of war, issuing a Chinese-style law code, making Buddhism a state-sponsored religion, and collecting taxes on agriculture. And through military conquest, Shila gained access to the Yellow Sea and direct maritime contact with China, which helped them develop alliance with Tang China, as we just saw. Gaia was also known for production of iron and trade ties with Japan, whose rulers commanded considerable labor and resources. But of course, Shila absorbed Gaia in 562, which helped them expand their territory. So in 589, the Sui dynasty reunified China after centuries of division, thus changing the political and military balance in Northeast Asia. And both Sui and Tang launched campaigns against Goguryeo, but they all ended in defeats. Each of the three kingdoms sent envoys to China, including Queen Sodok of Shila, who asked the Tang Emperor Taizong to pressure Goguryeo to cease its attacks on Shila, which he did in 644, but at this point in time, this campaign ended in a failure. However, Tang continued to try attacking Goguryeo from the south with their alliance with Shila, and first by way of attacking Bakje that received its support from Japan. So it was Japan and Bakje versus Shila and Tang. And this helped this was in favor, the outcome was in favor of Tang and Shila, of course. And then so the Bakje refugees fled to Japan. And Tang China set up 5 military command posts to administer Bakje territory after the fall of Bakje. One of the Goguryeo princes defected to the Tang and contributed to Tang and Shila efforts. And after Goguryeo fell in 668, Shila created a coalition of forces, including soldiers from the defeated armies of Bakje and Goguryeo, to help drive the Chinese from the peninsula in 676. And relationship, of course, between Shila and Tang soured for a while, but their alliance against Balhae, which is again the northeastern sort of regional territory, that secured their relationship back to what it was before. So Shila borrowed much from the Tang bureaucratic model. They set up post stations complete with horses to speed up the movement of officials and government horses, and communication, of course. Board of academics with specialists in medicine, law, mathematics, astronomy, and water clocks were created. Agency for Buddhist temples and monasteries were also established. Shila capital at Gyeongju, which is on the southeast of the peninsula, was laid out in checkerboard fashion like the Tang capital in Chang'an. And in 685, King Sumun divided the country into administrative units modeled on Chinese practice, creating 9 prefectures that were subdivided into 200 superior districts and more than 300 ordinary districts. Magistrates were selected from among the aristocrats, and they were dispatched from the capital to govern these districts. And by 680, the government established 5 small capitals in addition to Gyeongju, and sent members of the aristocracies to live at them and to spread Shila culture throughout the conquered territories. But this kind of ended in a failure because the aristocrats did not want to leave Gyeongju. Buddhism entered Korea during the Three Kingdoms period, so around 360 to 370, through monks that were dispatched by non-Chinese rulers in North China and Chinese Eastern Jin State. Bakje also sent Buddhist monks and 2 specialists in Confucian learning to Japan with the Analects and the 1,000-character classics, as we just saw in the film of Bakje. Buddhism gave Goguryeo and Bakje kings a political edge over the dominant aristocratic families, who were basically, ruling or sort of guiding the politics from within. Monks who can read and write Chinese help spread Chinese learning and Confucian ethics, not really to the commoners at this point yet, but within the aristocratic and the royalty, they did. And Buddhist temples and monasteries in mountains provided refuge from strife, because there were a lot of wars going on during this period, and Buddhist art and architecture also provided a lot of inspiration. And as we just saw in the film, right, in Korean, in Bakje, Goguryeo, and of course Tang China, there was highly developed, sophisticated forms of art and architecture that was inspired by Buddhism at this time. Not so much in Japan just yet. So Sheila kings adopted elements of Chinese statecraft to strengthen their position because, like I said a little bit earlier, the aristocracy was very much in control of the court, culturally as well as politically. And the aristocracy were sort of developed this thing called the bone rank system, kolpum, and this bone rank system created sort of this caste system where people held hereditary positions, and social mobility was very much restricted. And it was this bone rank system that later led 4 successive rebellions against Sheila King by murders and attempted usurpations, leading to the decline of Sheila. But as early as 3rd century, Sheila had a council of chieftains that exerted a check on the development of royal power, which is the origin of the Council of Notables, or the Huabaek, who were selected by the aristocrats in the council and held his position for the life of the king. Sheila was much more aristocratic than Tang China in the sense that only the aristocrats were allowed to take the civil service examination, and young men of the true bone families participated what is known as the flower youth cult group, that practiced military skills with cultural activities such as poetry, writing, that cultivated their social bonds all the way into adulthood. So when they became military captains or generals, they would have this bond that with their flower youth mates. So some true bone aristocrats had thousands of slaves, thanks to prisoners of war captured in Sheila's victories over their rivals. So, okay, so we'll listen to a little bit that explains a little bit about this bone rank system.
The bone rank system of ancient Korea was used in the Shilla Kingdom, 57 BCE to 935 CE, in order to signal a person's political rank and social status. Membership of a particular rank within the system was extremely important, permitting a person to apply for certain jobs and deciding how they would live their everyday lives. The rigidity of the system, based as it was on lineage, allowed for very little movement between the classes, resulting in a stagnation of talent, which evidently cost the Shilla dearly. The bone rank system, so called because it was based on a person's hereditary bloodline, was introduced as part of the new law code in 520 CE by King Buyeo, who lived from 514 to 540 CE. The caste system had 3 main classes, the highest being sacred bone, then true bone, and finally head rank. The Shilla kings, who descended from the Pak royal line, or their successors the Kims, were all of sacred bone class. From the mid-7th century CE, the sacred bone class was abolished, and thereafter royalty held the true bone rank along with the lesser royals, ministers of high office, and high-level aristocrats. The head rank class was the largest and itself divided into 6 subclasses. These were numbered, with ordinary people belonging to class 1, 2, and 3. The aristocracy belonged to levels 4, 5, and 6. These top 3 levels were linked to a person's family ties and or land they owned, and certain clans dominated the higher positions. Membership of the head rank class was necessary for a person to be considered for civil and military roles in the state apparatus, with the most senior position reserved for those in the high-numbered subclasses. One's bone rank decided the type of people one could interact with socially, who one could marry, and how much tax had to be paid to the state. Further membership of a specific level was necessary for a person to enjoy certain types of housing. Not only the size, but also decoration. For example, ceramic roof tiles were a very practical and visible badge of rank in Korean society. Bone rank decided which transportation people might use, the types of saddle they could set on, and the number of servants they were permitted to have, and even which utensils they could use. Clothes were another visible indicator of social status. Men who were members of the true bone class were not permitted to wear clothing that was embroidered, brocade, or fur, while only women of sacred bone rank could wear hairpins inlaid with jade or gemstones. Although a particularly appreciated service to the monarch or a senior government official might bring a reward of land and titles, there was otherwise not much chance of climbing the social ladder. As the historian K. Pratt notes, quote, social mobility was rare, and for most people, their occupation and social status was inherited, end quote. That is to say, one's birth was by far the most important factor in determining the level one would reach in society as an adult. Even the son of a merchant might expand his father's business considerably, but this new wealth would not entitle him to access to higher levels of the bone rank system. The rigidity of the system allowed those who had power to keep it unchallenged, but one of the unfortunate consequences of it was the talent often went unrewarded, and the state lost the opportunity to use gifted individuals for the good of all. Indeed, the social stagnation has been cited by many scholars as one of the factors leading to the ultimate downfall of the Sheela regime.
Okay. So just like the podcast mentioned, the sort of the aristocratic system was maintained by marriage, basically. And so the first 8 kings of the Sheela dynasty came from the Pak lineage, and all queens from the Kim lineage, while the next 8 kings from the Sok family and the queens supplied by the Kim and Pak families, and so on and so forth. So there were these, couple sort of, strong lineages that sort of intermarried with each other, creating what is called the double descent system. So the father line and the mother line sort of gave you the hereditary sort of position in society. But because Sheela had a strong alliance with the Tang China, this created sort of mobility among the people, facilitating travel, commerce, learning, and the dissemination of Buddhist culture. So Sheela monks studied in China, Sheela military officers enrolled in Tang armies, Sheela scholars competed in Tang examination system, appointed to office in China, and several Tang cities had Sheela wards where merchants and students from Sheela had lived. So it wasn't, completely stagnant in the sense that, Sheela was open to trade and commerce and with China. Okay, so let's listen to the Korean history of Sheela times.
The year 57 BC marks the beginning of the Sheela dynasty. Together with the Goguryeo and Baekje, Sheela was the third of the three states era, controlling the southeastern region of the Korean peninsula for 1,000 years. Sheela fostered dramatic development in the sciences, mathematics, culture, and religion. Chomsongdae, one of the world's oldest surviving observatories, provides us with a glimpse of Sheela interest in science and scientific technology. The structures and edifices of Sheela temples and stone towers are extraordinarily well balanced and show early advances in dynamics and mathematics. Sokkorang Grotto at Pulguksa Temple shows remarkable proportions of hexagons, octagons, perfect squares, and applied trigonometry. Like the Parthenon, Sokkorang Grotto shows beauty and elegance, but with more optimal proportions. The Shilla people could rightly boast of their metallurgy techniques. A representative case is the Bangang Seusang, a mysterious smile hinting at sadness. Elegant curves, picturesque knots. The rhythmical formative arts of Korean Buddhism are widely praised for their virtuosity, even compared with those of Japan and China. Thanks to Shilla's highly developed printing and paper-making technology, Mugu Chongwang Te Darani Gyeong, the Darani Sutra, the oldest book printed by wooden type plates in Korea, is also the world's oldest. The Shilla dynasty endured for more than 1,000 years. Its Hwarang was an elite group of male youth responsible for the dynasty's endurance. Taught in the educational principles of loyalty, filial piety, fidelity, bravery, and humanity. The Hwarang were nurtured as political and military elite members, and came to play a great role in eventually unifying the three states and managing the emerging dynasty. After reunification, Shilla stabilized and began a brisk trade with foreign countries. Shilla's seaborne trade in the East Asian region was led by General Changmogo, who established the Chonghaejin naval base on Wando Island, and from there rid the waters of pirates.
Okay, so next we'll talk a little bit about Balhae, only because your read-in talks about Balhae, and it's this small region on the northeastern side of Korea or southern Russia that faces what is that? The Sea of Japan, or what the Koreans would like to call East Sea. So after the fall of Goguryeo, one of its generals died, Joyeong, who is from a Mughal ethnic group, established a state with 400,000 people in an area that extended south of Sungari River and included the present maritime province in Siberia and about the northern third of the Korean peninsula. So Malgal is a semi-nomadic tribe like the Shanbei, Khitan, and Jurchen, and also the later Manchus. Balhae, governed by the Malgal, should be considered Korean history, although some dispute this. But you know, the explanation that was given in the textbook was because its main enemy was Shilla, and Balhae also ruled much of what is northern Korea today. So their capital in northern Manchuria was laid out in the grid-like model of Tang China, and the structure of government was also modeled after the Tang. So as we will see in the video, China is sort of claiming that Balhae was their territory, but you know, Koreans would like to claim that it's their territory. So it's sort of like a disputed area today, but it was its own state back then. Tang adopted a conciliatory policy toward Balhae in 605 to prevent it from allying with the Turks, who were their major enemy at the time. But Emperor Xuanzong of Tang challenged by Balhae in 726 by granting a title to the chief of the Amur River Malgal that resisted Balhae rule in 726, which led to Balhae attacking the Tang alongside Japan in 732. Which ended in their victory. For 2 centuries, the Balhae ruled over northern Korea, often at odds with Shilla, although serving as a buffer for Shilla against the inner Asian nomadic forces such as the Turks. And Balhae was eventually undermined by rebellions of the Khitans, who captured its last capital in 926. So we'll look at a little bit about Balhae's sort of contested history.
In 698, 30 years after Goguryeo collapsed, Daejo-yang, a general of Goguryeo, was continued to resist, founded the Balhae kingdom with the former people of Goguryeo and the Mongols. Balhae assaulted that they are the successor of Goguryeo kingdom and concentrated to expand territory. They gained northeast and every region in North Manchuria, and took back most territory of Goguryeo. However, today, China distorted the history of Balhae and claims that they were a minority race in their empire. China asserts that Balhae was founded by the Mongols, not Goguryeo people, and it was not an independent country but a local government of Tang, because Balhae had tributary relationship with Tang, especially the castle Sangyeong, the capital of Balhae, was the second biggest city in Northeast Asia, next to Castle Chang'an of Tang. Although a place of Goguryeo style, well and traditional heating system of Korea, Ondo was discovered. Chinese government blockaded this castle and is restoring them by the method of Tang since 2002. After the restoration, Chinese government will try to register this castle as World Cultural Heritage and receive recognition that Balhae is a part of Chinese history from the world. However, there are many proofs that Balhae is an independent kingdom, not related to Tang, and that Balhae succeeded the Goguryeo have discovered. First, the 5-metal currency, Balhae Tongbo, which was excavated in Castle Sangyeong in 1930s, was proved as the metal currency of Balhae. Balhae Tongbo letters, reign year, and the range of territory was carved on this metal currency. China has no record that Chinese carved reign year and the range of territory. Balhae Tongbo is the important evidence against Chinese Northeast Asia project. Second, the native tile of Balhae, Songkut Muni, fingertips pattern roof tile, was excavated in Cheonchu and Seodae tombs, which are the representative of royal tombs of Goguryeo in China's Jiban city. Songkut Muni roof tile, which was carved the end of 5 fingers on the edge, was discovered only in the heritages of Balhae. The discovery of this tile in an old tomb of Goguryeo is the epoch-making evidence that Balhae people repaired these old tombs and Balhae was a successor of Goguryeo. Third, a tomb of Princess Jeonghae, who was the second princess of the third king of Balhae Moon, was constructed by Goguryeo-style tomb. Goguryeo-style tomb has walls laid up with faced stones, and their ceilings have mausoleum structure, which is same as Goguryeo ceiling structure. According to the cemetery stone, Princess Jeonghae's funerary rites were continued for 3 years. This funeral tradition has origin from Goguryeo. Fourth, Balhae's people used Ondo as same as Goguryeo and succeeded many techniques and traditions of Goguryeo, such as fortification, building style, and tool. Moreover, according to King Mu's credential was sent to Japan in 727, Balhae recovered the territory of Goguryeo and have kept customs from Buyeo. Japanese called their envoy to Balhae as Goryeo-sa. It proves that they recognized Balhae and Goguryeo are the same country. Even famous Chinese poet and translator for Balhae government, Itebek wrote that Balhae is foreign country, not Tang's local government. And the record that Balhae's founder, Dae Yang, was from Goguryeo was found in Chinese history book, Gudangso. It is hard to research Balhae's history because their territory is in today's Chinese territory. But Koreans decided to excavate Balhae's sites with help of Russian researchers, and is getting many accomplishments.
So I think these contested areas are interesting when thinking about, East Asia as a region, because obviously there was a lot of traffic within the continent as well as, across the sea. Okay, so now we'll talk about early Japan, up to 794 CE. There's not much in concerning, written records of Japan in Japan, because at this point in time, Japan was still sort of very much living in huts, and sort of they started farming rice from the Yayoi period, but before that, a lot of people were fishermen, or they were hunters and gatherers. They were not settled. So the Yayoi period was, let me see, when was the Yayoi period? So this is from 300 BC to 300 in AD. So this is when, rice farming began. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. The earliest written records concerning Japan are thus found in Chinese sources. The Han court received delegates from small kingdoms, probably in Kyushu in 57 and 107 CE. By 239, there was a king called Himiko who sent tribute missions to the kingdom of Wei. Chinese sources note that warfare was endemic in Japan at the time. Himiko is said to have dominated an alliance of 30 chieftains, lived in a palace fortified with watchtowers and guardhouses, and rarely appeared in public. She is considered to have been like a shaman, able to communicate directly with the gods, and her brother, the only person to see her except for servants, conveyed her commands and prophecies to the people living outside of the gates. So in Himiko's time, which is pretty much the Yayoi period, religious beliefs held society together in conjunction with politics, so that her task was to perform rituals that pleased the gods as much as to command the people. Important people became gods, and that local gods ordered the conditions for their existence. So this is really what, kind of the thought of animism is based off of, that all these beings, whether they're animate or inanimate, they all possess this sort of power or life force that sort of regulates the weather, gives vitality to mountains, rocks, nature, constitutes the energy that makes the rice and all these other plants grow. Human reproduction is considered to sort of imitate these sort of animistic powers, and brings life to the world. So sacred texts from the 7th and 8th centuries connects gods and mortals, celebrates sex and having children, and venerates the natural world. So there isn't this strict divide between nature and culture, in as in the Christian, sort of the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? There is the natural world, and then there's the man-made cultural world. But in Japan, this is very much blurred through this idea of animism, and this is pretty much constitutes a lot of people's belief in Japan today as well. By late 4th century, huge tombs filled with ritual objects, were made to pacify otherwise threatening departed spirits. So these tombs were, like the video that we just watched. It was sort of created in the likeness of the Goguryeo tombs, but they were different, in the sense that they had this indigenous sort of figurines created. And these were clay figurines that marked the boundaries of the tombs. So we will look at these figurines, which are called the haniwa in Japanese. Let's see. Oh, sorry.
We're in the Tokyo National Museum looking at a haniwa figure of a warrior.
Haniwa are clay objects, sometimes cylinders, sometimes later in their development figures and animals that decorated the tops of tombs in Japan beginning in the 3rd century through the 6th or 7th century.
These tombs could be enormous. The largest one is nearly 5 football fields long.
And most of them were keyhole shaped. The circular area at the top was mounded, and that's where the burial chamber was.
These landforms were often surrounded by moats and were originally cleared except for haniwa, which populated their tops.
And populated is a really good word because on some of the largest of these tombs, obviously meant for the most powerful people of this time, there could be between 10 and 20,000 haniwa occupying the top of the tomb, sometimes arranged in a circle around the outside, sometimes a cluster of figures toward the center.
Often around the form of a house. All of this clay is low fire and unglazed, and that gives it its characteristic reddish color.
And by low fire, you mean it's fired at a low temperature, so we're not talking about a very complicated technology to harden this clay.
Well, if you have 10 to 20,000 of this to make when somebody dies, you need to do it quickly.
Although I imagine, just like in many other cultures, a ruler often made arrangements for their funerary objects or their tomb even while they were alive, so many may not have been made at the last minute, but this is all clearly for rulers and elites.
It's also interesting to understand the evolution of haniwa. The simplest and earliest forms are cylinders. These seem to have developed into the houses that we spoke of, and that was followed then by animals.
And then figures, and the figures and animals are of a remarkable variety. So there's a sense both of agriculture, of farming, of livestock. There are chickens and ducks and other kinds of fowl, and there are wild boar, and we also see horses and soldiers. We see musicians.
And women.
In fact, there's one lovely female figure here touching her breast with one hand and offering a cup with another, who is beautifully, luxuriously dressed with a necklace and a bracelet, and her garment is both painted and incised. And it's a good reminder that many of these were painted.
And many of them are elaborate. Let's look at one of the most elaborate, a larger warrior haniwa.
The word elaborate is really good for describing their clothing. The faces and bodies can be very simplified.
It suggests to me that the clothing represents their station in life, and that's what was important. It wasn't important who they were individually, but rather the part that they would play in the afterlife of the ruler. This particular figure looks like he's doing a very good job guarding the tomb. He's armed with a sword. He's armed with what is probably the remnants of a bow. He's got a quiver on his back, and he's completely covered in a Japanese style of armor, known as kiko, plates of armor that hang.
You can see the details of how the armor was made.
You can even see that he's wearing a wrist guard to protect his left arm from the string of a bow after he unleashes the arrow, because when the bowstring is loosed and snaps back, it can hit the arm and hurt.
And what's wonderful here in this museum is that we have examples of the armor.
And you can even see how the armor is constructed. Plates are joined together with metal rivets, and those are represented by small little buttons of clay on this haniwa.
So we're talking about iron plates that have been either fastened together with rivets or in other cases perhaps tied together with leather.
There's a tremendous amount of specificity. If you look at the scabbard that holds his sword, you can see that it's tied with a string that wraps around the back of his waist on either side, and you can even see the knot on his right hip.
And speaking of ties, you can look down the backs of his legs and see how his armor was held together.
I love the way that the flaps that come down from the helmet to protect the sides of his face frame that face and create a shadow that creates a kind of dimensionality that is a little bit rare in Haniwa, which tend to be quite flat and cylindrical.
In fact, the word Haniwa means clay cylinder, and we know that the earliest Haniwa were simple cylinders, but even as they develop into human figures, so much of the form remains cylindrical. Often the arms are simple cylinders, the legs are simple cylinders.
But they're so expressive nonetheless.
What's fascinating, though, is this combination of realism and abstraction. We talked about the level of detail in the armor, but in other areas, when we look at the bodies of Haniwa, the arms are too short, the legs are too short, they're not realistic at all.
The emphasis instead seems to be on a kind of expressiveness.
And although these may not look frightening to us, they may have looked serious and formidable during the Kofun period, the old tomb period when these were made in Japan.
Okay. So, beginning around 350 CE, so this is right after the Yayoi period, the rulers in the Yamato Basin, so this is right here, just near, and this is the enlarged picture of the Kinai region, which is where the Yamato Basin is located, and includes present-day cities of Kyoto, Osaka, and Nara. So this region is called Yamato, but the people who sort of occupied and consolidated their power in this region is also called the Yamato sort of lineage. So it's both the place and the people. 2 centuries later, the Yamato oversaw the forging of iron implements and its distribution. Warriors on horseback improved the speed and distance that armies can travel. 5 kings sent tribute missions to China during this time. Yamato also provided military support to Baekje against Goguryeo, as we discussed earlier. And when Baekje fell, many of its best educated and highly skilled supporters fled to Yamato and brought political and administrative talent and knowledge with them. So one of the first emperors to sort of, in Japan was Emperor Yuraku, who placed immigrant and local chieftains into a ranking system. So each chief was deemed a lineage head and was permitted to build grand tombs like the ones that we just saw in the film earlier. Each lineage received a hereditary title derived from Korean terms that defined its position in a new court hierarchy. The chieftains claimed descent from a lineage god or from a person who had a special relationship with the lineage god. Sorry, this all should be from instead of form. And they acknowledged Ryuraku as their overlord by sending family members to serve at his court and tribute in return for the right to administer and tax the territories he allotted them. Occupational groups were also organized into lineages, such as those who provided weapons and armies to the court, those supplying the kitchen to the court, and those performing rituals to the court. Within 25 years of his death, power struggles between royal relatives aided by chieftains wiped out Yuraku's line. But what remained was the royal regalia of mirror, sword, and jewel that is still the case of the emperor, the imperial family in Japan today. And at that time, they selected a princess to serve the royal family's guardian god at the sun goddess's shrine at Ise. So at this point, they've also sort of created the sort of national, well, you wouldn't call it the national sort of temple back then, but sort of the roots of sort of the Shinto shrine at Ise. Okay, so Asuka period comes after sort of the Yayoi and the Kofun. And this is when the Bakushe sort of immigrants have come to Japan, and this is part of the Soga lineage. They have entrenched itself as the principal consort givers in Japan, and in 592, a Soga niece named Suiko became head of the Yamato house on the death of her husband, who was her half-brother, and ruled until 628, which became the longest reign for the next 12 centuries. So this Suiko is perhaps one of the best-known female Japanese empress. Suiko and Prince Shotoku, her nephew and advisor, opened relations with the Sui dynasty, paving the way for later study missions and the immersions of Japanese men into Chinese culture. They promoted Buddhism and reorganized the court by instituting a ladder of 12 official ranks bestowed on individuals to correspond to Sui rather than Shila practice. And then Prince Shotoku is famous for developing this system called the 17 Injunction, which announced a new ideology of rule based on Confucian and Buddhist thought. And what this did was it created a distance between the ruling Yamato line and all the other lineages. So basically, he said that the Yamato line was from the heaven, and all other sort of local chiefs were from the earth, right? So they were mortal beings compared to the sort of the sacred lineage of the Yamato. And ministers were public duties, their duty to the throne above the private interests of lineage and the self. Only the ruler was to levy taxes, and the relationship between ruler and all others was to be expressed in ritual and governed by propriety. So basically, he's instituted this sort of hierarchy, made it very official, and this also helped implement the Taika reform of 645. So this Taika reform sort of marked the start of monarchical rule, and it was followed by a bloody coup in which Nakatomi no Kamatari, who is the founder of the Fujiwara lineage, which will become very important for Japanese government for centuries later. But in any case, the Nakatomi no Kamatari destroyed the Soga line and purged Koreans from the government. And the court appointed provincial governors and abolished private land ownership. They also reformed state population census. They created a centralized tax system, a legal code, instituted a civil service examination system. So all the things that that was sort of dominant at the time in China as well as in Korea. It also curtailed the ability of local power brokers and protected the rights of women to remarry. It provided a municipal government for the capital, and it instituted the use of Chinese-style era names, which often changed when the ruling families lost their potency to ward off disaster. So Emperor Tenmu is basically sort of the first official emperor after the Taika reform, and it was the 17 injunctions and the sort of the very clear distinction that Prince Shotoku had made between the sort of the godly, the sacred families of the emperor and the other local sort of mortal chiefs that allowed Tenpu to implement the Taika reform, but he couldn't do it alone, so he needed the help of these very strong sort of aristocratic or sort of, at this time it was a military power which the Fujiwara family sort of represented. So Fujiwara also needed this legitimacy of the emperor, so they consolidated their position by giving their daughters to rulers, a tradition that had some success in maintaining this, relationship between the military and monarchical intertwining, I guess you could say, until 1924. So Tenmu and his wife Jito, who was a daughter of the previous monarch, killed off their relatives to secure the throne for their descendants, which is called the Jinshin War, and established the Ritsuryo system, which is of legal codes that established a centralized government, and these codes were derived from Confucianism and Chinese legalism. Tenmu reorganized the bureaucracy, filled it with men he had appointed rather than the chieftains turned aristocrats of the local sort of warlords. Tenmu tried to abolish the aristocrats' private economic basis by experimenting with state allocation of land. Tenmu also banned the private possession of weapons in 685. Jito claimed the sun goddess Amaterasu at the Ise shrine as Tenmu's ancestor, thereby projecting his dynasty into a mythic past and asserting divine lineage for the ruling family. But this term Tenno sort of fell out of use in the 10th century. So there was a period in time when Japan didn't have a Tenno, although it is traced all the way back to the time of emperor and even before. So there were a series of legal reforms during the Asuka and Nara periods, and which, the Ritsuryo system, it wasn't just implemented once, but it was implemented and revised over again. So in 669, it was implemented for the first time, and then in 689, 701, 720, and so forth. And this introduced Confucianism and legalism as part of the Japanese Code of Ethics and Government. And the Japanese codes were, obviously different from the Chinese system in that legitimacy of the government positions and class status was based on birth rather than merit, and that emperor's power came from imperial descent rather than the mandate of heaven. Right. So it just kind of borrowed, ideas that were beneficial for the Japanese system, but it wasn't completely a Chinese system. In any case, the penal code of the Ritsuryo system set out punishments for rebels and robbers, as well as breaching the taboos that conferred sacred status on the emperor. The administrative code specified relations between the ruler and aristocrats and bring the ruler's jurisdiction down to the level of local strongmen. It established political and religious hierarchies of public offices, temples, and shrines that reached from the center to the provinces, and all land basically belonged to the ruler, which were allotted to the farmers, except in a few cases of new fields that had to be cultivated, and in this case the person undertaking the cultivation would receive permanent ownership at the time because perhaps because it was very difficult to open new fields. Now the Nara period following Asuka period was an interesting time in that the capital was moved from Fujiwara, which was also in the Kinai region, to Heijō-kyo, which is present-day Nara city. And Emperor Tenmu and Jito had done this move. So in 710, the capital was moved to Nara, and it remained there until 794. And Nara was modeled after the Tang capital of Chang'an, so it had that grid-like formation with the palace at the top, and then facing southward because the Chinese view of the universe, the ruler's place was fixed like a North Star. The central boulevard divided the city into symmetrical halves, just like the Chinese-style bureaucratic structure balanced the ministry of the left with the ministry of the right. And the physical layout mirrored social relations so that officials lived on assigned building lots in accordance with their rank, and they would move when they lost their position. So we'll take a look at this brief lecture by Kanda University on the Nara period.
Hello, I'm Andrew Kane Deitch, and we're
continuing our look at modern Japan. Today's topic, the Nara period, the age of Buddhism and Chinese knowledge. Now, I'm going to start by pointing to a couple of key points. The Nara period is a time of great change when, facing overseas and domestic pressures, Japanese rulers consolidated their rule. The second point, this new era was represented by the capital itself, Nara, a political, economic, and cultural center which set the tone for the dawn of Japan's classical age. Now we start by looking at the Asuka period, which connects together the Kofun period we looked at last time and the Nara period that's going to take up most of our time today. There's a couple of things to note about the Asuka period. So first of all, we have literacy becoming widespread at the court. This is the time when we start to find our first historical records. Another major development is the arrival of Buddhism from Baekje. Now, Baekje is one of the three Korean kingdoms and was something of a Japanese ally in ancient times. And at one point, as a reward for services rendered during the struggles in Korea, Baekje introduced Buddhism to Japan. One of the interesting things to note is that the missionaries, when they arrived with all of the knowledge and information about Buddhism, they didn't say to the Japanese court that this is some kind of great religious tradition we're giving you. They said this is an interesting tool of statecraft that can help you rule. So this tells us something that when Buddhism first comes into Japan, it's already associated not with a type of liberational religious tradition per se, but actually with politics right from the start. Another important thing we have in the Asuka period, we have the spread of Chinese knowledge, goods, and customs. And this is enabled by something that we later came to call the Silk Road, a massive trading network that connected the eastern part of the Western world all the way across to Asia. And finally, another key development in the Asuka period is something called the Hitsurol system. And this is a series of land and law codes that were based on Tang Dynasty China. At the time, the Tang Dynasty was the most powerful country in East Asia and may have been even the most powerful empire in the world. In fact, it has been referred to by some scholars as a medieval superpower. This was a sign of how great its influence and power was. Now, the Silk Road that I was talking about, here is just a rough sketch about the main parts of those routes. You can see that it runs from Europe all the way over here, through Persia and India down into China. And so through its connection to Korea and the continent, this is how Japan is able to access that route. And therefore not just bringing goods from China, but also with things from other countries as well, connected to the same network. The Nara period, you might recall a moment ago I said that it's a time of, on the one hand, overseas pressure, and on the other hand, domestic pressure. Now, let's start with the overseas issue. First of all, we have a unified Korea. Now, this is obviously a concern for Japan because Korea had been broken into three kingdoms for a long time, many centuries of conflict. Historically, when countries that have been divided come together and form unified states, they tend to have a higher chance of becoming aggressive to their neighbors. And so, understandably, there was a concern in Japan that a strong, new, unified Korea might become a military threat. At the same time, there was a very powerful China next door as well, because again, the Tang Dynasty, that medieval superpower, it's right there and very, very powerful, and it's already shown that it's interested in expanding its influence into other regions. So again, people in Japan at the time, they're aware of this development and they're a little bit concerned. At the same time, we have domestic pressures because there had been a change in royal lines. They're going to shift from one brother's line of descent to another within the Japanese royal family. And so the new rulers, their family was standing on a little bit of unsteady ground concerning their legitimacy. They wanted, on the one hand, to prove that they were legitimate and deserved to rule the country. They also wanted to keep the country strong.
To bring this about, they launched a series of reforms. We see that new words at this time became standardized. We have the word Nippon for the first time starts to become used as a standard term for the Japanese territory. We also have Tenno, heavenly sovereign, starts to be used as the term for the Japanese ruler instead of the older terms like great king. There's a well-organized government based on the Chinese system. Now, imitating this type of system from China was not something that was only done by Japan, it was also followed by other kingdoms as well within the Asian sphere. This was because, as I mentioned, the Tang dynasty was extremely powerful and influential, so many other countries imitated what they believed to be the strongest parts of those systems. There was also strong government support for religious organizations. This was not just because of any kind of support for the ideas of the religions themselves, but because of the government's desperate need to shore up their legitimacy. So one of the ways that you can do that is to try to gain religious legitimacy by encouraging religious institutions to support you. And it's also the time when we have the official histories in Hanshoki and Fujiki compiled. Of course, a large part of those histories was based on older myth and legend that had been passed down from oral tradition. But at this point, they were officially compiled as texts for the first time, and a strong element of that compilation process was designed to show that the current ruling family was legitimate and deserved to continue to rule the country. Well, were they successful? Essentially, we can say yes. The results of this were, first of all, a stronger and more sophisticated state, and second, it established Japan as a distinct, independent country with its own royals and its own traditions that was culturally and politically distinct from China. Second thing I want to do now is to talk about Nara itself, the capital city, which reflects so much of the society and culture of the period. Now, the new capital was located in Heijo-kyo, nowadays called Nara, and the design was based on the Chinese capital of Chang'an. Now, at the time, Heijo-kyo was a very large city. It had a population of about 100,000 people, which was very significant by the standards of the time, and this rapidly became the center of Japan's political and economic world. Here we have an illustration of what Chang'an, the Tang Dynasty capital, looked like. You can see that there is a clear type of layout here. We have the royal palace in the middle, and then we have the whole city divided into a western and eastern side with markets structured all along this careful grid pattern with these intersecting streets. This became the model for other capital cities around East Asia, and in this regard, Heijo-kyo was no exception. So we see a similar type of layout here. We have the royal palace right at the top, so it of course facing south, and then we have the division of the city into western and eastern parts, all carefully laid out in the same type of grid division. What about Nara culture? Well, the city Nara was not just the center of the political and economic world, it was also the center of the religious, artistic, and cultural worlds at the time. This was where the major temples and the monasteries were located, especially Todaiji. It was also the center of the schools and the great emphasis at the time that was put on Chinese learning, particularly in the areas of medicine and technology. Here we have a picture of the Great Buddha, the Taibutsu at Todaiji, which was a major project and rapidly became a major pilgrimage spot for believers. Now, Buddhism at the time was very much a religion of the upper classes and the urban elite, but it slowly expanded throughout society. And as we'll see in a later lecture, eventually more popular types of Buddhism also took root in Japan. Another point to consider with Nara culture is the dawn of great literature. We have both Chinese style and Japanese style poetry at this time. And we also have the development of printing. Now, printing is probably something you associate with Western Europe and Gutenberg, but actually other societies have had types of printing even in ancient times. And in Japan, we have an example of some of the earliest printing in East Asia. Shotoku Tenno carried out a project called the Hyakunan Todarani in the year 764. And this project is designed to reward all of the temples that had been supporting the state by taking a Buddhist sutra and duplicating it and then sending it out to the temples in these little pagodas. So this is what they look like. Here we have two of the extant pagodas and the printed text. One of the things that's particularly significant about this is that these texts have a very smooth type of a printing method that appears to have been used. Likely they weren't printed using wood blocks, which deteriorate over time, but probably with a type of metal plate, which really would have been innovative at the time. So, I think we can say that the Nara period was a time of important changes. There was influence from the overseas, and this combined with local developments to create a new society centered at the capital city, Nara. Thank you very much.
Okay. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Emishi people because your reading talks a little bit about Emishi. So by the 8th century, right, the aristocrats and the ruling elites at Nara developed, as we just saw in this lecture, a sense of Japanese ethnic identity. But this was synonymous with the agricultural rice-based communities that was centrally, located in the Kinai region. But there were people in the northeast who still practiced the Jomon style. Jomon is the period before the Yayoi. So these were the hunters and gatherers, and if they were practicing agriculture, they were engaged in a slash and burn style agriculture where they would move from one location to another, like literally slashing and burning the weeds and the sort of bushes to make the land fertile, but you can't go back to the same area for another decade or so. So this is called the slash and burn agriculture. So these were sort of a nomadic or semi-nomadic people, and these people were deemed as barbarians, and Emishi literally means barbarians. So the Emishi occupied the northern regions of Japan, and they spoke their own language, and they were physically different. They were more hairy, and they had tattoos on their bodies. And they were skilled warriors who rode and traded horses mainly. By 725, however, the first year of Emperor Shomu's reign, the court had pacified the region up to today's Sendai city by sending emissaries to set up district offices, collect taxes, dispatch military expeditions to remove or enslave the Emishi, so basically colonizing, the Emishi territory. So these people have become extinct, and if you are a fan of Japanese anime and have seen Princess Mononoke, they talk about Emishi in this video clip here. So I'll show that a little bit. It's only 52 seconds long, so I'll show that to you.
It's 500 years since the Emperor destroyed our tribe and drove the remnants of our people to the east. Some managed to survive here for all these years, but the blood of our tribe has grown thinner and weaker with each generation. Now our last prince must cut his hair and leave us, never to return. Sometimes I think the gods are laughing at us.
Beautiful bow. I've seen one other like it. Have you ever heard of the Emishi people? They're said to ride red elks. They also use stone arrowheads just like you. Of course, they were all wiped out 500 years ago. Don't worry, I won't tell anyone where you're from. Anyway, I've got much bigger fish to fry.
So the Emishi people are considered to be sort of the indigenous groups of Japan, and similar to the Ainu up in Hokkaido, and also the sorry, I kind of flipped out. In any case, so they were considered to be the indigenous, but Emishi itself, the name itself, is not. It wasn't named by the people from that tribe. It was, basically a foreign name given to them by the Yamato clan, basically. And just as in the lecture that we saw, Buddhism, which was introduced initially by the Soga clan through Bakje, received official government support in 587. And this was, first opposed by local priests, who were more, by nature, practicing animistic sort of rites and rituals. But with the 17 Injunctions, Prince Shotoku urged the court to revere the Buddha, Buddhist law, and the monks. Tenmu and Jito used Buddhism's resources to spread their rule across Japan, and their effort made Buddhism a core component of courtly life and practice. So, it was, literally used for political purposes. So Tenmu and Jito built temples in the capital and provinces and used them as storehouses for population and tax records. They also oversaw the copying of sutras, held Buddhist ceremonies, and performed Buddhist purification rituals. And they also Buddhism itself, restricted hunting, fishing, and eating of meat. And this was also promoted by the imperial household to promote Buddhist beliefs. Shomu did even more to promote Buddhism, ordering each province to build a 7-story pagoda and a nunnery to eliminate social unrest. So at this time, right, there were the court was, going out to the east to colonize the Emishi, and there were also a lot of political unrest between different factions. This is why, right, the 17 Injunction and the strong sort of centralized government was necessary to sort of create a hierarchical order of the local chiefs. But of course, there was still a lot of friction within Japan. So they said, okay, here, Buddhism, this is a good way to sort of consolidate, sort of give a consolidated culture across the islands. And the great Buddha of Todaijin Temple in Nara was also one of the construction ordered by Emperor Shomu to, appease the civil unrest, as well as to sort of legitimize, the emperor's rule. And like we just saw in the lecture, Nara is also a period when the texts are produced. These are basically the historical texts of Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, but these are also very much based on sort of the mythical figures of the gods and goddesses that are supposed to have created Japan, such as the Amaterasu no Omikari, the sun goddess of Japan. So this was produced in the 700s, and also books of poetry, such as the Kaifuso and the Manyoshu. These were also cultural products that developed during this period. So this sort of wraps up week 3, early Korea and early Japan. If you have any questions, please email me. I'm available via email. It is yuka.hasegawa@faculty.umuc.edu. Okay, thank you very much.